Thanks so much for joining us here on 90s Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. You may have seen what unfortunately turned out to be a viral video of Republican senatorial minority leader Mitch McConnell appearing to freeze up on camera back on August the 30th. The 81-year-old senator from Kentucky does appear to be okay. That's the good news, but it's now the second time that's happened to him in the last couple of months. So for a bit more what could be causing that and what you should do if you see that happen in an elderly person, we're now joined by 90s medical expert Dr. Payal Kohli for a bit more about this important topic. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So Dr. Kohli, I guess the first question I got, before we kind of get into what happened and some of those specifics, what's Senator McConnell's medical history as far as you know?
You know, it's a little bit unusual because he had polio as a child, and the polio can attack, your ability to walk, and that left him with some gait instability issues. So he does walk in a funny gait, and that could be a result of his childhood polio. But what we've seen manifest this year has been 3 different falls, once in February, once in March, and then once again in July. And the one that he had in March was pretty bad, actually. He ended up having a concussion. He had a broken rib from it. So that kind of sets him up potentially for some of what's happening right now.
And what do you think, based on what you saw specifically on this August 30th incident? I'm asking specifically about that because a lot of people saw it. It went kind of, again, viral, made the rounds on the news. What do you think happened to him?
Very hard to tell just based on what it looks like. Certainly I would want to see brain imaging. I would want to see an EEG, which looks at brain wave activity. But given that he's had this concussion recently, given that now this is his second episode, and during the episode, if you notice, he kind of turned his eyes up and to the right, almost as if he was sort of staring off to the right. He looked like he was not hearing or responding to any verbal or auditory stimuli. So people were talking to him, didn't look like he was really sort of registering, and he had a blank look on his face. So putting that all together, this could be very consistent with what's called an absence seizure, or an absence seizure, where you essentially just have an absence. Your brain kind of goes on pause for a second, and it's a type of seizure. And a seizure can occur in 1 to 5 out of 10 people after a traumatic brain injury. You can get a seizure disorder. And so the traumatic brain injury can sort of set you up for seizures, which are misfirings or malfunctions of the brain that can happen because you create scar tissue in the brain. So depending on where you got hit, depending on the degree of the concussion and such, if he does have a seizure disorder, it's not uncommon for it to manifest itself multiple times. Now, his aides and his medical team did say something about him feeling lightheaded. Usually when you have a seizure, you don't really have insight into the fact that you're having a seizure because your brain is kind of playing a trick on you, so to speak. So it would be nice to know what he actually felt. Does he remember what happened? Because a lightheaded feeling and feeling like you're going to faint or feeling dizzy is a very different phenomena from what this looked like, which was a neurological event where the brain kind of goes on pause and he's not really responding to the cues.
What does that mean for him long term? Do you think that becomes more common? And also, is this common in elderly people?
Seizure disorders for the first time in an elderly person is less common. We sometimes see it more in kids, but as I said, after traumatic brain injury, it is common. And it's not normal. So it still means that the brain is misbehaving or misfiring. So for me to assess his ability to sort of return to work, I would want to see certainly whether there's anatomical or structural changes in the brain. So what does the MRI of the brain look like? Is it looking okay, and this is just a malfunction of the functioning, so there's not a structural abnormality? Or does he also potentially have had mini strokes or underlying strokes as well? Does he have any changes in atrophy or shrinkage of the brain tissue, which would make his ability to do higher level cognitive activities a little bit more difficult? If it's just a seizure disorder in isolation, once the seizure is done, you're kind of back to normal. So think about it like your computer freezing and then it restarts and it's kind of working okay after that. But if it happens over and over again, or it's in the setting of having other underlying structural abnormalities, I would want to see how he performs on a neurocognitive test. So a formal test where they check his memory, they check his executive function, they check the types of things that he has to use in his day-to-day work, and of course his life, to try to see are there subtle things that are not showing up necessarily when you interact with him on these tests. That would be how I would decide if he's really fit to sort of go back to work.
And speaking of which, do you think the fact you mentioned the job that he's in obviously requires a high degree of cognitive ability more than the average person? Do you think that the fact that he's in such a high-profile position obviously more stress than the average person, you would imagine. Does that potentially play into this at all, or no?
You know, it's interesting, but seizures, the threshold for us, our brain to have a seizure, can be very easily triggered by stress, by alcohol, by lack of sleep. And so you'll often see in individuals who have seizure disorders that high stress can bring it out because it makes those brain cells a little bit more irritable, a little bit more prone to malfunction, so to speak. So certainly if that's what this is, that could absolutely be playing a role, as well as the fact that he's a little bit older. And so your ability to compensate, perhaps he's on medications, that can change your threshold for having a seizure disorder as well. And if he's on medicines to suppress seizures and still having seizures, then certainly his neurologist would have to think about adjusting those medications as well, because they're not working to take away the thing that is happening. So again, speculating on all this being a seizure, because we don't have a lot of transparency from his doctors about exactly what happened, but if it looked like an absence seizure and that's what it turns out to be, certainly his job could be contributing and exacerbating the number of episodes that he's having.
That's interesting. And that leads me to, I think, what's going to be a very important question in the broad scheme of things, because we're likely heading to a 2024 election, which will be a presidential election here, which could be, without commenting here politically, obviously, this is going to be featuring, most likely, 81-year-old Joe Biden versus 78, soon to be 78-year-old Donald Trump. We've got numerous senators. Dianne Feinstein, California, is, I believe, 87 with multiple health issues. Chuck Grassley, I think, is almost 90 years old. Medically speaking, should people this old, 80 or above, be serving in these kinds of offices? Again, medically speaking, purely.
Medically speaking, older individuals need to be evaluated for their fitness to serve, because we know that as you get older, the brain shrinks. We know as you get older, the ability for memory and higher level functions goes away, and it's different for every person. So it's not a blanket statement that your age should be a prohibitive cutoff, but for example, I'm a cardiologist. I see patients every week who need annual physicals in order to drive a truck, because they're working for the Department of Transportation. And they need to know that their heart is good, that they're not going to pass out behind the wheel, that there's not something going on that sets them up. Similarly for pilots, similarly for other types of, where other people's livelihoods and well-beings are in your hand. And I think this is the same sort of thing. Maybe it's not their life that's in your hand, but their future, their politics, their economics. And so if you are making decisions, you should have neurocognitive testing after a certain age to make sure that your memory, your higher level executive functions, your ability to make decisions, your ability to think clearly, all of those are still intact. Because we know that even in healthy people, age itself sets you up to have a deterioration of those types of functions over time. So I do believe that hopefully this opens the door for a wider discussion about how we physically, mentally, and emotionally screen our candidates, whether it's presidential or at any level, when they're serving in a leadership capacity, because we need them to be at their fittest to make those types of decisions that can impact us. And if they're having issues with memory or having issues with physical health that impair their ability to do that, I think that could create a domino effect on all the decisions that they make.
And again, I kind of think about this a bit more, because it does feel like, I think it's not just a feeling, there's real proof that we've got a lot more octogenarians in high positions of power. And again, we're going to be faced with a decision in 2024 with two soon-to-be or octogenarians as well.
Yes, and we're doing better at keeping people alive longer because we're getting better at prevention. Yeah. So I think this is going to be a continued problem, not just in politics, but in all aspects. In our field itself, with doctors, this often comes up as well. So if your doctor wants to keep practicing into their mid or late 80s, but you feel like their memory, their recall, their ability to make decisions is not quite as sharp, especially in procedural specialties like surgery. What if they have a tremor, what have you? Is that somebody you really want to be doing surgery on you? And so I know in medicine we're very, very careful about doing these mandatory retirements for people, but it's all very anecdotal. It's not formally assessed, and there's nothing like that. So I think we have to balance, obviously, people having illness and allowing them to recover and go back to the job that they love, against, something that's more chronic and something that's age-related that's not going to get better. And we need to get better at discerning something that's reversible versus something more chronic, progressive, and underlying, like getting older and not being able to function as well as before.
Absolutely. Well, a fascinating topic, no doubt about it. Obviously interesting, but it seems like for now that Senator McConnell's okay, and certainly hoping for that to continue. But Dr. Payal Kohli, thanks so much for joining us for a bit more about this.
Thank you, Chris.